Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. Today's request comes from patron JimJam78, who wants me to take a look at an old Stephen King novel titled Firestarter. The book came out in 1980, making it the sixth novel King published. About the author. Stephen King was born in Portland, Maine in 1947. His father left his family only a couple years after he was born, forcing his mother to raise Stephen and his brother as a single parent, and get assistance from relatives scattered throughout New England and the Midwest. She eventually managed to settle back in rural Maine, giving King a stable school life, and he would go on to graduate from the University of Maine with a bachelor's in English. King also met his wife at the university, and they would marry the year after he graduated. King has said that he was fascinated by horror stories from a very young age. His first exposure was a collection of H.P. Lovecraft short stories that his father had left behind, and he would go on to be a fan of horror comics like Tales from the Crypt. He published several short stories during his university years, and while he also wrote several novels, he wouldn't get any published until Carrie in 1973. In the meantime, he worked as a high school teacher in Hamden, Maine. Including Carrie, King published 5 novels in the 1970s that gained him increasing amounts of popularity, especially after Carrie was adapted into a horror film in 1976. He continued to work as a teacher for some time after that, but he moved on to teaching writing at the University of Maine in 1977. All told, King has written dozens of novels and short stories, along with several nonfiction works, a number of screenplays that includes both adaptations of his novels and original works, and a few comic books. He's been predominantly a horror writer, but he's also written dramas like The Shawshank Redemption, fantasy books like the Dark Tower series, and science fiction thrillers like The Running Man, and today's work, Firestarter. King continues to be a prolific author to this day, and that's despite facing numerous issues like an addiction problem that spiraled out of control in the 80s, and that one time he got run over by a minivan in 1999. For some time after that, King couldn't sit down for an hour without feeling excruciating pain. Anyway, Firestarter was written before most of that happened. Like most King novels from this period, the book was well received and would be adapted into a movie, and in this case that was a 1984 Universal Pictures film that was almost directed by John Carpenter, but then The Thing flopped in theaters. As it was, Firestarter flopped even harder, and unlike The Thing, it never developed a cult following. Luckily, we won't have to worry about any of that, because today I'm taking a look at the book. The review. In the late 1960s, Andy McGee and his future wife Victoria take part in a college experiment that tests a drug created by The Shop, a top-secret government research group that's basically the CIA, but not. Both of them develop mild psychic powers from the drug they get injected with, but the Shop only keeps tabs on them until they give birth to a child who turns out to have tremendous psychic potential. Her abilities include telekinesis, premonitions, psychic intuition, and, most importantly, pyrokinesis. One day in 1979, the Shop makes its move, killing Victoria and kidnapping the child, Charlie. However, Andy is able to use his power, psychic domination, to get his child back. The two spend the next year on the run, almost get caught outside Albany, New York, escape Shop agents at a farm in Hastings Glen, and then spend the winter in a lakeside cabin in Vermont. They then get captured thanks to John Rainbird, a Cherokee Indian assassin with a death wish who also seems to be a mild psychic himself. The two are then moved to a secure compound in Northern Virginia and tested for 6 months. Rainbird manipulates Charlie into trusting him, but Andy is eventually able to dominate his test supervisor, warn Charlie about Rainbird, and arrange an escape. Rainbird discovers the plot and kills Andy, but then Charlie unleashes her full power and burns the whole compound to ashes. After spending another 6 months lying low, she eventually escapes the Shop's schemes once and for all by telling her story to the Rolling Stone magazine. The end. I'm going to start this review by telling you about the parts of the book I didn't like. Afterwards, I'm going to tell you why those complaints don't actually matter. First is a minor complaint that mostly comes from me being too much of a scientist. Charlie McGee has a stupid amount of power at her disposal, to the point that she has trouble controlling it if she does more than light a little kindling. I can suspend my disbelief for psychic powers in general, but the idea that Charlie can achieve surface of the sun levels of heat when she doesn't concentrate hard enough? It's just too much for me. I get the narrative purpose of having the power be hard to control, but then I also think about the conservation of energy and how incredibly hard it is to generate that kind of heat when you aren't fissioning uranium atoms. It took me out of the story, but I'll admit this was probably a very personal issue. A more general problem I had was the rather Freudian approach to child psychology that the book takes. Now, I understand why this is, since the book was written 40 years ago by a man who was not a psychologist of any stripe, but it still puts a lot of weight on the Oedipus-Electra complex and the idea of childhood fixations. Fortunately, the story cares more about individual characters than about Freud's theories, but Freud does still have an influence over how the plot progresses. The most substantial issue I had was with the portrayal of the villains, who have a very comic book feel to them. By that, I mean that while they have some complexity to them, and a fair number of sympathetic moments, they also lean heavily on cliches and have an over-the-top presence that pushes them beyond realism and into melodrama. Rainbird is a stereotypical stoic Indian warrior with a supernatural ability to hunt and endless amounts of patience. And while we get an explanation for all of these traits, he's a mild psychic, he's a Vietnam War veteran, and he's a special ops assassin, he also never transcends the stereotype. It's more like he fully embodies it, revels in being it. The funny thing, though, is that using this approach for villains kinda works. Because Rainbird is never more than the Native American hunter, because the director of the shop is never more than the cutthroat black ops bureaucrat, it means that we never end up fully sympathizing with them. It means that even though much of the book is told from their perspectives, we never root for them or feel sorry for them when they die. Embracing the stereotype creates a certain amount of detachment from the reader, and that detachment can be useful when you want your story to have clear heroes and villains, and yet also tell part of the story from the villain's perspective. Aside from all of that, Firestarter also features several hallmarks of Stephen King's writing that have helped him stay popular throughout his career. The writing is punchy and fast-paced, and there's a lot of overlap between the narration and the point-of-view characters' inner thoughts. The dialogue is naturalistic and fairly good at capturing the individual voices of the characters, and between that and the narration, you get a very good feel for who these people are. Something else the book does is tell a very non-linear story. The novel starts with Andy and Charlie escaping New York City and taking a taxi to Albany, and it fills in the earlier parts of the story throughout the first half of the book. This decision made a lot of sense to me, since the Albany escape starts things out with a lot of tension, and the flashbacks are mostly told in linear order and in complete story chunks. So while the story has a lot of twists and turns, and the tension builds and falls, I never had any trouble keeping track of what was going on, and I was always interested in what would happen next. As far as King novels go, it's not his best, but it's also far from being his worst. If you were to ask me for a King recommendation, I'd suggest the revised version of The Gunslinger, Wolves of the Kala, Misery, and maybe The Shawshank Redemption. But if you were to ask me whether Firestarter on its own is any good, then yeah, it's a pretty good book. The analysis. In the afterword to the book, King explains that he was inspired to write Firestarter based on a number of real-life incidents. Chief among them are cases of supposed spontaneous combustion, the interest the United States and USSR had in psychic powers, and that one time when the CIA secretly drugged people with LSD to see if they could use it for interrogations. As such, one of the biggest themes of the novel is government overreach. The shop exists in a space where the ends justify the means, and at various points their operatives explode an airliner being held hostage by terrorists, rob a postal worker, shoot and blackmail a farmer, torture and murder a housewife, kidnap a 7-year-old girl, bully local law enforcement officers, ignore due process, and cover up the fact that several college students died or went incurably insane thanks to that initial drug test. They also planned on killing Charlie once they got the test data they wanted, and no one in their organization had any problem with that. The reason why the shop is allowed to trample all over American lives and values is because they might eventually create a drug that would allow US soldiers and operatives to wield psychic powers. Of course, there's also an undercurrent of fear. fear that the Soviets have progressed even further with their psychic division and may develop an unbeatable lead if America isn't able to catch up. And while this fear inspired great things in areas like space science, it also inspired terrible things in the less public arenas of espionage and nation building. I said earlier that the depiction of the villains in Firestarter is like a comic book and how over the top it is, but let me clarify what I mean by that. I don't mean that the book is unrealistic when it describes how far certain people are willing to go when motivated by fear and hatred. I mean that it's unrealistic when it comes to how thoroughly and cleanly they're able to cover up the giant messes they make. Federal agencies have been able to cover up the terrible things they've done. Sometimes they've kept things quiet for years, but, and the book even points this out at one point, secrets have a way of leaking out and becoming public knowledge once enough people know about them. By all rights, the shop should have been exposed for all of the incompetent messes they made long before Charlie went to the Rolling Stone. But then, of course, that would have made the story less gripping. There's also a less visible theme that centers around Charlie's pyrokinesis. While her psychic abilities are powerful, they aren't all that fundamentally different from things that normal humans experience. Charlie feels a visceral excitement when she burns things with her mind, and afterwards she feels guilty because of everything she destroyed and everyone she killed. Regular humans also feel the rush of excitement when they get angry and lash out, and once the heat of emotion leaves, they feel guilty for what they did when they were angry. So in the end, what Charlie goes through is similar to what a soldier goes through on the battlefield. She learns to harness her power, her anger, to keep it under control even when she's using it, and then put it away once she no longer needs it. She grows up. That's why I'm glad the book doesn't go the route of having someone kill her because she's too dangerous for this world, or having her commit suicide because she's become a monster. Charlie's pyrokinesis is an allegory for temptations that real people have to live with every day, and in the end, Charlie learns to live with hers. All in all, it's a pretty hopeful message. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.